Welcome to the Fantasy Golf Bag Podcast, presented by FantasyGolfBag.com, your number one source for the most in-depth PGA Tour analysis in the daily fantasy and sports betting world. Each week, our experts will discuss everything you need to know, from the course preview and key stats to top plays, fades, and strategies. Whether golf betting, grinding out cash games, or playing for a big GPP win, our team has you covered. Let's get after it.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Golf Bag Podcast. I am your host, Redkacheek, joined today by a couple special guests, and we are going to be previewing the WGC Mexico Championship. I'll go ahead and bring in one of the guests. It is, as always, JkrayASU. Jacob Ray, how's it going, man?
It's going good, Drew. Pretty excited about this event. I know it's a little departure from our standard course rotations and cuts that we've seen for the most part of the early calendar year, but mixing it up a little bit with this no-cut event, so looking forward to it.
Yep, limited field, no-cut event. Not ones we are always thrilled as far as Draftkings goes, but to kind of help us with the international taste that we're going to see this week. A lot of us in the United States don't get to see these players every single week, and of course the data is somewhat limited. So to kind of help us navigate a bit, we got our special guest, Mr. Ben Coley from Sporting Life. I think most of you know Ben writes an article every single week tipping off guys he likes the most in the betting markets for that event. You can find him on Twitter at Ben Coley Golf. Ben, how's it going, man? Thank you so much for joining us today.
No, it's good of you guys to have me on. Thank you very much. Yeah, good. Thank you. Looking forward to this event. Like you said, it's kind of felt like a bit of a slog through the West Coast this year with the weather that we've had and the interruptions last week at the Riv. And before that, I'm not really that keen on the multi-course Pro-Am events as much as I am more straightforward ones like this. So really looking forward to it. Better weather, I'm sure, and hopefully a good European showing, because it is a golf course that has brought up some European presence in the past. So yeah, looking forward to it and very much pleased to be chatting with you guys.
Yeah, thank you. No, I read a couple of your articles from the prior years, and definitely the Europeans was a focus of what you were trying to target at least. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those, the tournaments that you thought correlated well and the players that, you know, obviously we may not have heard of, or the majority of the Americans haven't heard of. But tell us a little bit, just briefly, of kind of about your history. Obviously, most people know you write about golf, but kind of give us a little background on how you got into this space and you know, where your history kind of stemmed from.
Yeah, I guess like most people, a bit of fortune, a lot of hard work and all that sort of thing. But I'm the son of a betting shop manager, so I've been interested and involved in betting for my whole life, which is something my wife would prefer I wasn't, but there we go. And then so I moved to the city I live in now in the north of England about, 10 years ago now, to work as a radio journalist, actually, believe it or not. I know I talk too quickly for that, but there we go. And I got to know a guy called Dave Tyndall, who I'm sure some of your followers are also aware of. He's a brilliant golf writer as well, and I became friends with him, and he very kindly let me do some writing for the website I write for now. And yeah, I've not budged. I like it. So that's me. Yeah, it's a great job to do. You know, I'm very lucky to do it. It comes with pitfalls. You know, people like to have a pop at you when you're not doing so well, but at the same time, you get a lot of nice comments every week, and people are grateful for the content, as I'm sure you get with the podcast as well. So no, it's a great job. I should say that I'm rubbish at golf. I think most people who write well about it don't necessarily play it so well, but I like to play. I'm enthusiastic, but I'm not very good.
Well, I know England doesn't always get the best prime golfing weather. I think you have to deal with, you know, whatever kind of comes that weekend. But I know I've had a few friends from England, and they always, you know, when it got rainy in Florida, they were like, "This is normal. This is definitely something average."
Yeah, my friends and I, for a while, did a sort of annual golf trip to the Belfry, which is a formerly famous golf course in England. It's not quite what it used to be, but obviously I had Ryder Cups there. And we used to go every December, which is crazy, really. But we've played in snow and all sorts. So yeah, it's not really conducive to year-round practice, but that's not a reasonable excuse for me. I'm just not very good.
I gotcha. Nothing wrong with that. That's why they have, you know, different tees. They have handicaps, all that stuff.
Do you know what? It's why golf's the best sport in the world. You don't have to be great. And the thing I know this sounds a bit sort of wimpy now. But the thing I love most about golf, as become a father and can't play as often, it's my chance to catch up with some friends and not worry too much about what goes on the scorecard and just, spend 4 or 5 hours out on the golf course.
Exactly. Yeah, that's one of I play obviously a good bit still, and Jacob plays regularly, but the worst part, and we kind of saw that this weekend with JB Holmes, got a lot of flack for it, but the length of time it does take to play, that's the only downfall. And I think things like Topgolf, which I believe stem from Europe, those are things that are bringing a lot of new golfers to the sport just because they can casually go play for an hour, 2 hours, have some drinks, have some food, and it makes it a very casual sport. They don't have to slog through 5 hours, on a golf course shooting 90 or something.
Definitely. I've got some friends actually in London who have never before shown an interest in golf, and suddenly there are those places popping up in London where you can go and do exactly that, and they love it. It's that thing, isn't it? If you can get people to play golf, enough people will fall in love with it to sustain it and to help it grow. But it's just that getting people to play in the first place is quite difficult, because they figure they've got to dedicate a heck of a lot of time to it. So I'd like to see more par 3 courses personally. I mean, I love playing par 3 golf. So that's one of the things I think they could do a little bit more with. But nowadays people are at least thinking about how to get people into golf, whereas I think even 10 years ago, there was that kind of golf kind of existed in this way that we don't really need you. If you don't want to play, don't play. Whereas now it's realizing that actually we need to include people a little better, and it's getting there.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate it. We can, don't probably have to dwell on last week too much. It wasn't too much to talk about. Most of the people we will talk about during the show played last week, such as Justin Thomas had a terrible second place finish last week. But we'll go ahead and roll into the golf course, talk about the Club de Golf Chapultepec. We'll kind of briefly talk through the altitude situation. I know you have some course comps. We might bring that up now. And then we'll get into some players and kind of run through the DraftKings pricing, 10K all the way down to the 6K. And I'm sure you got some nice sleepers, the international flavors that we desperately need this week.
I hope so.
All right. So, again, this golf tournament will be hosted at Club de Golf Chapultepec in Mexico City, Mexico. This will be the third year hosting the event. Plays at a pretty significant altitude at about 7,380 feet above sea level. It's a par 71, 7,300 yards, and Poa annua or the greens. So one of the interesting things about the grasses down there as far as Poa annua, this is the same grass we saw the last 2 weeks on tour in California. It was some of my research. I was looking through some Mexican events, and the first one obviously has been on Twitter everywhere is the Matt Kuchar Mayakoba caddy debacle. But nonetheless, the greens there were paspalum, so it'll be somewhat different than what you'll see at here at the Club de Golf Chapultepec. So it's really not a lot that I can glean from the grass type there. The golf course will play significantly shorter, as we saw in 2017, and it was similar last year. The average driver distance for some of the guys was basically 310 yards, and that included 3-woods and irons off the tee. So the altitude is definitely going to make a significant impact on the overall course yardage. It is an interesting fact with like the altitude is not just the distance is basically enhanced, but the side spin and spin in general is typically decreased. So guys will tend to hit a little bit straighter, but they'll have a little bit less accuracy on some of their distance control with spin. So you'll notice a lot of guys, they'll try to club down, but they're still hitting irons like 280 off the tee. So it's pretty remarkable. The golf course is tree lined, so I was kind of fascinated with some of the scores from the last 2 years. Last year, the winning score was 16 under par, and that was in a playoff with Phil Mickelson and JT. And then in 2017, the winning score was 14 under par by Dustin Johnson. So overall, I'm really just targeting ball strikers, guys that have been playing well recently, tee to green. I like to look at a lot of the traditional stats such as green and regulation and driving accuracy, fairways gained, stuff like that. And, with the mix of guys coming from overseas, I try not to get too caught up with, main PGA Tour stats, just because you can get really torn and, wow, these guys really grade out well, and you'll start to overlook guys, like Tom Lewis and all these other ones that you might not know otherwise. So I'm trying to keep an open mind, use the stats that we have on the PGA Tour as a reference for the guys we see every week, but really that's why we have Ben on the on the phone today, trying to pinpoint the Europeans and the ones that have the best chance of playing well, especially at altitude. I think is going to be a huge advantage this week, especially with a limited field of 72 players. So I'll kick it over to Ben first, and then to Jacob. But if there's anything noteworthy that I may have missed as far as the golf course and the layout, etc.
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, those Poana greens are fairly interesting. I mean, unfortunately, we've got a sample size of just 2 events, which, I mean, there's a pro and a con to that. When we've got sample sizes of 20 years or whatever, everyone's got the same info, whereas at least with a couple of events, and I was on Tommy here a couple of years ago, Tommy Fleetwood, and it was a clean slate. No one really knew what they were preparing for, and therefore you've got that chance to maybe just find something and theorize, if you like, and sometimes it works, obviously sometimes it doesn't. But the Poana thing, obviously, if you look at the 2 winners so far, DJ and Phil, they're 2 of the best Poana players there's probably ever been. You know, their California records alone are astonishingly good. So I thought you'd like to think that if you're trying to find the winner of the tournament, some of those guys who've won out there in California would be an advantage. And okay, that doesn't necessarily whittle it down, but it does go. It's kind of a mark against Rory. I know he's been playing well every week, but he won the WGC match play in San Francisco. But his record in California is a lot flimsier. It lacks the depth of a DJ and a JT, and even John Rahm, who of course won at Torrey Pines year before last. DeChambeau from California, etc. Ricky Fowler's record's not as good on Poana as you'd like to think, and there'd be a little question mark about Brooks Koepka as well. But I think basically the Poana thing is significant in that it suggests that this event actually comes quite nicely in the schedule this year. It comes on the back of California rather than going over to the Honda first. So you might see that the recent form that we've seen, the players who played well last week will carry on playing well, which isn't always the best thing from a betting perspective, but in fantasy terms, in DraftKings terms, it certainly helps clear through some of those players.
Yeah, that's actually interesting because those guys getting used to Poana, or at least having a consistent surface for the last couple of weeks, instead of having to jump to Bermuda at the Honda and then back to Poana in Mexico. Now they get it straight through Poa, and Poa again. So that's actually really nice for the guys that played in California the last couple of weeks. That's a good point there. Jacob, do you have any additional thoughts on the golf course?
Yeah, just before I jump in, quick question. Do you know the size of these greens relative to tour average?
I don't off the top of my head. I do not.
Okay. Ben,
I can't tell you the exact size, but they are smaller. Sorry.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That was my initial thought, was perhaps they were a bit smaller, and I know the feedback from most of the people that have played it within the last 2 years are that it's fairly undulating. So I know the approach is already sort of a key of the key stats, one that we're sort of keying on the most. But I know, Drew, how much you love proximity. But I can't help but think that, with the shortened course due to the elevation and small greens, undulating greens, I'm assuming you're going to want it to be in a particular part of the green that, how good someone is wedge play is going to definitely come into play. And what's the best way that we can measure wedge play? Is it not proximity? Or, I might be missing another stat, but I know that probably makes you cringe to hear me say that, Drew. But outside of everything that was mentioned, that was the primary thing that I was really trying to drill down on, was just what's the best way we can sort of gauge how accurate these guys can be into fairly small greens.
In short, I'm not a big fan of the proximity stats. I think they can be very skewed over the course of a season, depending on what events certain people play. But besides the point, strictly at this event, I don't think there's anything that would tell us, because they are playing at altitude. These guys are going to have to figure out they all bring TrackMans to the range when they're traveling. I assume they're all going to be testing out their wedges, their launch angle, some spin. Like I heard, maybe it was 2017, and I don't know if they tried it again in 2018, but a lot of them tried switching golf balls to a spinnier golf ball to try to basically counter the altitude. So obviously with the higher altitude, the ball will tend to come out flatter. They want more spin to stay up in the air, carry distance will be a little bit further, but it's just a matter of the player getting used to that. And I really don't know, besides guys, like I mentioned, the altitude and some other events, those guys have played really well. We talked about, actually Ben tipped Phil in 2017 maybe, and then in 2018 he won, but he had a lot of success in Colorado with altitude. So, and then I think Las Vegas as well. But
I'd forgotten about that, by the way.
Yeah.
Thank you for Phil Mickelson. I tell you what, Phil Mickelson, I just can't get him right. I tipped him in Phoenix before he won at Pebble just a couple of weeks ago, and whenever I tip Phil, he wins the next week or the next time they play that event, and he never wins when I'm on him. Yeah, everyone has a golfer like that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. You can't get them right. I'm the same way with Xander. Xander Schauffele, I'll skip him, and he'll finish, 1-2-1 in those 3 events. And then finally I'm like, well, he's going to be lower owned here, or he's around guys like, Rory McIlroy and Dustin Johnson and Jason Day. I'll play him. And he finishes like 30th. So I just don't get it. But yeah, so guys like that have played in altitude, and if you can see that they've had success judging their distance, I think those would be ones to target. Obviously, not everyone in the field will fall into that category, and it's very hard if you want to try to dig up all that. I had a tough time digging up the 2 courses that Ben noted as far as the elevation, the Hoburg Open and I probably butchered that name, and the Omega European Masters. But just going back a few years, I mean, that takes a lot of time. So I just look at traditional stats like green and regulation, and I really look at recent form from those California swing events just to see how guys are playing. And then that's why we have Ben for the European ones, because I have a tough time gauging, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ben, but like the type of courses that the European Tour plays could be drastically different from week to week. Like one could be bombers galore, and then the next week it's tree lined, it's 6,800 or 6,900, and it's just like a completely different test. And I think us gauging who has the best form coming off of similar courses is going to be quite important this week.
Yeah, I think you're right in that. I mean, if you look at the schedule last year, when one of the events we're talking about there, the European Masters, the week before it, they were in Denmark at sea level on a really exposed, windswept golf. Well, actually, it was quite tree-lined this year, but still quite windy and just a different type of test. And then they went to the KLM Open, which is a big modern golf course they're trying to get to host the Ryder Cup. And from there, they went to Portugal, where Tom Lewis won, which is just a wide open resort course. So there is more of that week-to-week change. I feel like in the US, I mean, I think sometimes in the UK, we're a bit guilty. Over here, the line is always, golf in America is always the same. It's just low scoring. And I think it's not true. There are lots of different styles of courses, but they kind of come in blocks. But they also come in that, like, the best guys don't bother with some of them. Like, Phil's not going to play Harbour Town anymore, right. Unless the RBC guys will go. But basically, the best players in the world have that week off because it's just after the Masters, etc. And there are other courses like that, like Colonial. For all that everyone will tell you, it's a brilliant golf course, and the Texans will play there and stuff. DJ doesn't play there, and it kind of works like that. They've got enough good events to choose from. Whereas in Europe, like, there are a few much weaker events, like however much Rory McIlroy, or he's a bad example now that he's spending so much time over there, but however much one of our best players likes the course for the Czech Masters, which is a huge golf course, any big hitter would have a good chance there. They're not going to go because it's not worth enough money and it doesn't sit nicely in the schedule for them. So right. I think there is that difference between the tours in that respect, but both have got this sort of same volume of different golf courses, if that makes some sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the last thing I'll kind of touch on as far as weather, it looks like we'll have a very uneventful event. The weather looks like it's going to be around 65 to 75 every day, and wind should be down. Like, it should be a really nice 4 days for these guys. There shouldn't be anything that pops up on the radar for Mexico City. So if you guys don't have anything left on the golf course per se, we can go ahead and hop into the DraftKings pricing. We'll start up there at JT in the 10K range, and I'll work ourselves down up until the low sixes.
Sounds good.
Alrighty, so the pricing this week is obviously very unique with only 72 players in the field. We have a couple guys, below 6,500 all the way up to JT being the most expensive over DJ at 11.8 and DJ at 11.5. It's always funny how they price the guy that's most appealing, the most expensive. JT coming off last week, he looked really good. And coming to this golf course, obviously where he finished second last year and fifth the year before, I have a tough time not going to him. I'm really not interested in DJ, which is interesting. But the other one up here in this range would be Rory McIlroy. I feel like Rory has really been more motivated, I guess, this year. Last year everyone talked about him kind of being off on his own, and he's just kind of, going event to event and really just not motivated, not in it. This year he started off outside of the Tournament of Champions. He's gone 5th place and then 4th place last week. I really like Rory here. He's gained a lot of strokes on approach. His green and regulation numbers look good. So those two up top for me, if I need to lean, is going to be JT and Rory, which isn't really a shocker. They're the most expensive for a reason. But those are the two I like the most. So I'll kick it to Ben first, then we'll go to Jacob.
Yeah, so there's nothing I can say against any of the top ones at the market, at the front of the pricing. I mean, there'd be a little issue with Rory. I agree with what you're saying. His motivation's very high. He looks like he's ready to win again. I mean, it's been such a long time since he was regularly winning. Okay, he won last year's Arnold Palmer, but the top guys, JT, Dustin Johnson, Bryson now, and John Rahm, they're winning regularly, and Rory's winning once a year at the moment, and that needs to change for him. I'm sure it will. I'd be a little reluctant with him here because I think it's the sort of course that might just frustrate him at times. And that would be my issue. I know he didn't play it last year and he played it quite well on debut, but I just have that little concern. And if I were to pick one from a value point of view, which is always kind of what I'm harping back to, I guess, but even in DraftKings terms, I think it still applies just as strongly, in fact. I think John Rahm's probably the one. I think it was inexperience, which cost him the title here in 2017. He looked like he was going to go and win it, a couple of late 3 putts. Set him back, and DJ was just there to take advantage. I think he lost by 2 shots in the end, and he gave those shots away over the closing 4 or 5 holes. And his run now is just sensational. He's going to places like Riviera last week where he's playing them for the first time, and he's finishing 9th. And he obviously won at Torrey his first visit there. But to do that is really impressive. And I feel like he's just taken that next step from it almost sounds silly to say he's taken the next step because he's won 6 times, but he's now finishing 8th and 7th and 5th when he's not quite on. And I think what we're seeing from Rahm right now in the first weeks of 2019 are the beginnings of one of those patches where he's the guy who wins 2 or 3 times in a row, and he's the guy who goes and wins a major or a World Golf Championship, and this would be a fantastic place to start. So I really like him this week, and he's spoken before that Poa annua greens, when he went out to Arizona to begin his college life there, the greens were a bit new to him, and in Spain where he grew up, the greens were a lot slower, bumpier, Poa annua, and I don't think he'll have any problems. He's already one of the most adaptable golfers on the planet, and like I said, he's played well here both times, and I see no reason he won't be right there again.
Okay, awesome. I got one kind of question, I guess, around John Rahm, but I'll kick it over to Jacob first. Who do you like the most up here in this top range?
So there are 2 guys in this range that I probably prefer over the others. Just as Ben said, it's really hard to ignore the sort of the run of form that Rahm has been playing at. I mean, dating back to the Tournament of Champions, he has 5 top 10s, 8th, 6th, 5th, 10th, 9th. I mean, that's just, even comparing that to JT, he's got 3 top 5s, excuse me, but a 16th is mixed in there. I mean, I think with these top guys, we are splitting hairs to some degree, but again, his maiden voyage at this event was a 3rd, obviously 20th last year. I just think he is a really solid option to start your lineups with. Certainly, you have built-in savings with that as well. Just by default, you're avoiding JT and DJ up there, and starting your lineup 10-7 or 10-3 with Ricky, or even 10,000 even with DeChambeau, which is the second guy that I have interest in, allows you a little bit more freedom with this type of pricing. So, like I said, Rahm is one of my favorites. And then, I might go back to DeChambeau this week. I can't help but think that people might move off of him a little bit. I mean, if you go down the list from the top till let's say Hideki at 9,000. I mean, that's, 10 or so guys. And I'm not saying DeChambeau would be the lowest owned of them, but he didn't play particularly well last week. And this is his first time playing this event. So those two knocks already might be against him. I could certainly see him being, owned just a little bit lower than the rest, and it might be an opportunity to gain some leverage against the field.
Yeah, Bryson's on my short list up here as well. He hasn't played the event, but you got to imagine with calculations being a factor, he should do fairly well, or he should be at least very prepared. So I do like Bryson. 10,000 seems like a pretty good price. The only question I had on Rahm is the last couple events he's done really well, and I've pretty much harped on him every single week to start the year off because he's been finishing so consistently. When you're talking about splitting hairs in this top range, the only thing that kind of popped out to me, and Dustin was kind of in the same category, but he hasn't been doing as much damage with his irons. We all know Jon Rahm's a tremendous driver of the golf ball, but on this golf course, I feel like the driver will be negated somewhat, even though we're trying to target longer hitters to some degree, but I feel like the irons are going to be most critical, and with his approach numbers, they don't look as appetizing to me as a guy like Rory just above him, or even Bryson, $700 below him. So that was my only qualm with Rahm. And I'm curious, Ben, like when you're maybe going through your week of research, or you're going through a player pool, PGA Tour or European Tour, how much emphasis are you putting on statistics versus their course history, how they've played there? And obviously recent form kind of falls into the statistics, but how do you kind of weigh those in your mind when you're working through some players this week or any week?
Yeah, I suppose it varies depending on the nature of the tournament to some degree. So when there's a tournament with very clear trends and pointers that I feel I can lean on a little bit, then I'm happy to do that. But I would say among the golf fantasy and betting fraternity of the many, many experts there are, I'd be on the lower end when it comes to stats.
Okay.
Certainly short-term trends, I can usually take a favorable view of even a pretty damning number. And you're right with Jon Rahm's numbers. His approach play does this. It kind of just drops off a cliff and then it clicks. And I tend to find that trying to figure out when it's going to click is quite difficult. Right. So I'm looking for the underlying things that, the things you can't necessarily measure, like the confidence of turning up to Riviera and finishing ninth, and the confidence of putting together that run of 6 top 10 finishes in a row, and it's 7 if you include the Hero, which he obviously won, and what beating Tiger in the singles of the Ryder Cup meant to him as a player. And I look more at those than I do the stats. And the difficult thing in that approach is that nothing is quantifiable. So, I guess I'm more of a feel player than a numbers player, but they're always a great starting point.
Yep.
Regardless.
No, I like that. I think this, especially golf, is a very weird sport where there is a sense of feel and how you interpret the data, whether it be recent form or not. There's a lot to be said for that, how you kind of perceive it. So I like that quite a bit. That's somewhat how I do it. You got to look at the numbers, but there's a sense of, what are the numbers telling you? It could tell someone else a different story.
That's it. And the context as well. One of the things that, let's take Augusta. There's always that line, you've got to win at Augusta, you've got to have shot sub 70 there in the past. And it kind of, it's okay. It'll give you a starting point, but unless you start applying some context, stats become worth significantly less, don't they? And I always think certainly when there's a stat or a trend that I can't understand, I can't explain, then I just tend to cast it aside because it could just be random.
Yep. Exactly. I feel the same way. All right, let's move down into the 9K range. We'll lead off with Jacob for this range. Jacob, what are you trying to eyeball here in the 9K range?
So, excuse me. Initially, when I started in this range, I thought to myself, I haven't played Phil really any this year, and I told myself last time that it happened, which I believe was the Pebble narrative, the Pebble course history narrative, that I wasn't going to avoid a course history narrative, particularly when it involved Phil. Now, granted, there are only 2 years worth of course history here, but it's hard to discredit his history at this event the past 2 years. Certainly, he finished seventh the first time it was held here, and then won it last year. So, definitely have some interest in Mickelson at 9,300. But certainly, there are two key guys that I'm really big on. The first is Koepka at 9,800. I think that number, that price is something that we likely will not see again, maybe not until the Masters in any event that he participates in, just because of the stacked nature of that one as well. But, Koepka not being a 5-figure price is really interesting. I think essentially we're getting him in a bargain. He hasn't played in a couple of events, so I think there might be hesitation for most there. And I believe he didn't play the event last year, but in 2017 he finished 48th. So again, not really great course history to speak of. So that's certainly interest in Koepka. And then the other guy that I have some real interest in, I imagine people are going to move to Hideki a lot, but I'd take that step just above him and really slot Xander in as a very high upside play. I know we key in on, two of the things that I look at the most are current form as well as course history as a whole to sort of tell a big picture about, where a player's game is at. And speaking of Schauffele, since the Tournament of Champions, which he won, he's gone 25th, 10th, 15th in his past 3 events. His first time out last year, he finished 18th here. I just really like the way that he's playing right now. His ball striking, particularly approach, has been excellent. And I know he normally is known for putting, which I think we saw was a little bit off. He had a stronger weekend than when he started at Genesis last week. So certainly Xander is catching my attention, especially at 9,100.
Perfect. We'll drop it over to Ben. Ben, what are you looking at here?
I love Xander as well, to be honest with you. He's kind of doing what Rahm and Bryson have been doing at just a slightly lower level, and I'm talking like a fraction of a shot. He's won 2 of his last, 7 or 8 starts. He's not finished outside the top 25 since going to Korea for the CJ Cup at the end of the year. A bit unlucky not to get a Ryder Cup place. One of the things I really like about him, 4 wins so far, 3 of them have been in no-cut events. So there might be something in that. I mean, it's a bit early to make conclusions about a guy who's been on tour for 2 years, but to go and win 3 no-cut events in elite fields tells you something. Obviously, the most recent of those was the last World Golf Championship when he just robbed Tony Finau, and I felt sorry for Tony, but that's Schauffele, isn't it? He's just a bit of a stone cold killer. So he's a player I like a lot. He's a lot cheaper than the elite guys, and yet he's now the number 7 in the world. And at the rate he's climbing and at the frequency with which he's winning, I don't really see him stopping there. His worst result this season came when he was paired with Tiger at the Farmers, which is a kind of a fairly new experience for a player like that. He's obviously a California guy, so Poana's not a problem. I think he's a really nice one in this section of the pricing. And the other one would be Hideki for me. There's the thing that put me off backing him was a slight course fit issue. In the back of my mind, I'm not totally convinced this is the course for him, but what I am convinced by is his resurgence over the last 3 tournaments, and I think he'll make a lot of birdies this week. He may make a few too many mistakes to quite finish in the top 3 or 4, but I'd expect him to finish in the top 10 or 12, and for that reason, I think we're basically talking about an elite player who's been in the doldrums, and he's still climbing back up to that elite level in people's minds, and there's still chance to get on him before it happens.
Oh man, I'm gonna ride the Xander train with you guys. He was like we said on the top of the show, one that I always miss. So hopefully I'm not jinxing him for you guys, but he's been so impressive, and the PGA Tour Live is somewhat of a valuable tool in my mind. I was able to, obviously not at the event for the Waste Management Phoenix Open, but I was able to watch him basically his entire round. And he drove the ball so bad. And I remember at one point I told some of our members that, hey, count Xander out, man. He's hitting it left and right. He's out of it. And he grinded out, and he ended up having a really, really good finish, finishing 10th. And he gained a good bit of strokes putting. But, man, he basically didn't know which way it was going off the tee. He was getting it up around the green. Even good shots were like getting unlucky and bouncing or spinning into the bunker, and he would get up and down one after another. And like that consistency when you're playing that poorly, at least in my mind, is a huge plus. Most of these guys, even like Bubba, he starts going a little sideways, and Spieth, we're seeing that a ton now. But, if it goes a little bit south for them, they just, I don't want to say give up, but they just don't really grind it out. And Xander still has that fire to finish out good rounds. So Xander at 9,100 I feel is a perfect price, and I'm going to play a good chunk of him. Hideki, 9,000 I don't have a problem with. I probably will lean Xander slightly over Hideki. At this altitude, I feel like Xander might be set up better at this event. And then on the high end, I know y'all didn't really touch on Tiger Woods at all, but he's the one that I think will be somewhat overlooked. Like Mickelson, I think, draws attention with his course history. Jacob kind of alluded to that. And, Brooks, 9,800, we haven't seen much of. He probably gets a little bit of attention at that price. But Tiger at 9,500, I'm interested in him. The only scary thing, I guess, is any fatigue he does have from last week. And it kind of stinks to say fatigue for a guy that we all know is in mostly incredible shape. But it did seem like he was pretty drained after Sunday's round. So I'm a little nervous on him traveling, but I am interested if his ownership comes in pretty low. $9,500 for Tiger Woods. I'll definitely sign up in a limited field event. He can make plenty of birdies. Scoring will be there. Sign me up there. So if you guys don't have anything else to add in that range, we can hop down into the 8K range. A bit of a better international flavor, and then we'll get into 7Ks and it's just loaded. But we'll lead off with Ben here in the 8K range and let us know who you're kind of eyeballing in this tier.
Yeah, so when I started looking at this event, I expected to be writing about Tommy Fleetwood in my preview a lot and putting him up as a player to bet. I sort of cooled off him a little bit because I don't think he's quite there, and he's playing some new equipment, and he's just, Tommy's so solid now that if he's not quite there, he'll still go and finish 30th or something at Riviera and give you something to work with. Mm-hmm. But actually, you really, to win in a field like this, you kind of, probably need a little bit more. So I went off him. The two that I'll give you that I was fairly interested in actually both come from that altitude factor. If you go back to the 2014 BMW Championship, Billy Horschel was the winner and Sergio Garcia was in fourth. Sergio, obviously, we have this ongoing issue around what happened in Saudi Arabia. He issued a good apology last week, which was nice to see. But in the past, he has taken a while to get over things like that. If you remember the infamous words he said about Tiger Woods in 2013, it kind of took him 6 months to get over that. I don't think this is as big a deal, but also last year when he had that horrendous Masters defense, again, it took him months to get over it. So my only issue is whether that happens again. But the upside to him here is that he even has a house in Switzerland, so he lives at altitude. He always plays well at altitude. He's played well here. And there were enough good signs last week when maybe he just shook off that newsworthy element and people started talking more about Cooch. So he's one of the ones I'd look to. Horschel was kind of priced higher than I would have expected. But maybe this is where you guys will know a lot more than me about the sort of tactics of ownership percentage. Maybe that will mean that he's not appealing to that many people. The plus side to him really was that win in Denver in 2014. I also think he started the year really well, and we only have to go back to the FedEx Cup playoffs last year when he really got on that roll. And I can see that happening again with Billy, and I think this is a good course for him. So I thought they were both interesting, and I do think there'll be players in this range that will be a little bit off the radar.
Okay. I'll kick it over to Jacob. You have anybody else in the 8K range that you're kind of eyeballing there?
Yeah, just a couple guys. So the first that I sort of talked about him almost in jest last week on our live stream, Drew, was Mark Leishman. Mm-hmm. He was kind of the late ad, and it turns out, he ended up playing very well. Now his numbers still, I think, are skewed. He had that win. Obviously, what was it?
early in the year.
Yeah. What was it? The Australian? No.
He won the CIMB late last year, didn't he?
CIMB, that was it. And then he's got, since the Tournament of Champions, he finished well at that to start the year off, and then followed that up with a third at the Sony. Not a great performance at the Farmers, but then another strong performance here at the Genesis. Not really that strong here last year with a 37, but I still think that there's some value there at 8,700. I think what's appealing, though, is a majority of the names around him, like Paul Casey is going to be popular with his course history and current form. Cantlay is likely going to be a little bit more popular. You've got Finau there at the top, starting off the 8K range. I think all these guys are going to get more attention than Leishman. And, strictly as an ownership play, I could certainly see, throwing him in some lineups just to take that angle. That being said, one of my favorite plays in this range is Webb Simpson at 8,300. I know that his approach numbers are really strong. We haven't seen him since, I believe it was the Phoenix Open, which really was his first event since the Tournament of Champions to start the calendar year off. And he came in, gaining a lot of strokes on approach, ended up finishing 20th there in Phoenix. So similar to Leishman, he doesn't have, his lone appearance here last year was a 37th. So not particularly what we're looking for, but I think that the quality of ball striker that he is, and then add to the fact the turnaround that his putting made really through the summer months, and obviously with the Players win and sort of culminating to some really strong performance there at the end of the FedEx Cup playoffs. Certainly Webb has got my eye. And then, of course, as Ben said, Sergio, I would gladly jump on the Sergio train again this week.
Yep. I got to go with Sergio again, 8,000. Really high on him last week. And I've been extremely excited to see him back in the States to play him, because his finish in the fall and really like late summer when he went back to Europe and finished off on the European Tour was simply incredible. I mean, he was hitting for some stretch of time, he was almost at 80% green in regulation. Did nothing with the putter, but still miraculous ball striking week after week. So definitely, I'm not too concerned with last week. I think that was interesting about what Ben said. It takes him a little while to get over, but hopefully last week after he got that first round out of his system, he really played better and just didn't do much after that. But yeah, I'm fine going back to Sergio 8,000. Like he said, the altitude thing is important to me. So I'm going to take an 8K Sergio, plug him into a majority of my lineups for sure. The other one up there, which you kind of glossed over, Jacob, but Paul Casey at 8,600, he may be popular. I'm not really sure, but he's too good of a ball striker. I'm not going to pass on that. His last 2 years here, respectable finishes, 16th and a 12th. So obviously he can, handle the altitude. I find it, I kind of asked this to Ben, I guess, but Paul Casey to me seems like a very Americanized golfer from a European aspect, just in the sense that his ball flight is somewhat high. He plays a lot of the American style golf that we see. He hits it high and it stops, and when he goes over to some of the European events that maybe is a little bit windier or rainy, it doesn't seem like he has the Tommy Fleetwood trajectory. He doesn't pop back into that mode very well. So I think he'll do well in this type of track. I don't know if you have the same sentiments there, Ben, but he's one of the few that he's obviously English, but he seems more American than any of the other guys from England, at least right now.
Yeah, and he wouldn't be the most popular golfer over here. I've really warmed to him over the last couple of years, but he's obviously made clear in the past with his Ryder Cup absence that he was less European than some of his contemporaries. He's kind of like Justin Rose in some respects, in that they hit the ball so high, and every year as English people, when the Open comes back here and British people, we're looking for who's going to potentially be the next guy to win it. And until Rose obviously nearly won last year at Carnoustie, his best performance in the Open was in the 1990s when he was an amateur. Yeah. And it's the same with Casey. I think 2010 at St Andrews, he was a distant second or third behind Louis Oosthuizen, but he just doesn't have that ability to adapt. Sometimes he wins in Europe anyway because he's just that good. He won the Irish Open and KLM Open on a linksy track, but that's just because he's brilliant, and brilliant golf kind of works everywhere. But yeah, you're right. He's a very American golfer, even in his accent. Just a final thing on him. I know it's a bit dull, but he's another one who owns a house in Switzerland, spends a lot of time there. So he's played a heck of a lot of golf at altitude. He likes to cycle at altitude and stuff. So he won't be running out of breath, that's for sure.
Awesome. I'll be plugging him in then too. And then, of course, Fleetwood, I like Ben said, he's got good finishes here, plays really well. Pretty much anywhere he goes, the ball striking is always consistent. That's something you try to look for. It's kind of funny balancing a guy like, talk about Paul Casey, a very good ball striker, Tommy Fleetwood, a very good ball striker, and you see events from like Bubba Watson they fluctuate tremendously on some events. He obviously has played well here, but Bubba's one I got a question mark on right now. I'm not sure if I'll jump to that. We'll kind of see, I guess, where ownership shakes out. So we can go ahead and hop down into the 7K range, and I'll kind of hit on the high side of the 7K range. I'll rotate it to Jacob and then Ben, and then we'll get down to the low 7Ks and see if we can kind of maybe get some sleepers from the Europeans. I know Alex Norn down there was one you tipped last year, the year before, Ben. So let me quickly kind of talk about the high 7K real fast. Rafa Cabrera Bayo, again, coming off some really strong finishes over here. He finished 22nd at Pebble and finished 25th last week. He finished third at this event last year. So, I mean, not a tremendous shocker that he's definitely on the list at 7,800. He's another one like Paul Casey. Ball striking stats always look good. So, definitely an easy one for me to target is Rafa Cabrera Bayo. Ian Poulter at 7,900 I think is really interesting to me. He hasn't played this event at this golf course. But he's been sneaky good the past year, and I feel like I would be missing out if I didn't play him. He finished off over in Saudi Arabia with, he played the Abu Dhabi, Dubai Desert, and then the Saudi International, and he went 6-3-6. Played really well in the States prior to that. It's been really, really solid golf for Poulter. So he's going to be one on my list. I don't know if Ben has any tips on him playing at altitude, but Ian Poulter at 7,800 is one I'm very interested in. And then the last one down here, Matt Kuchar at 7,700. It's hard for me to kind of, I keep wanting to discount him, and he just keeps playing well. And he's getting to that point where he's played so many weeks in a row, but he's been playing at such a high level, at least tee to green, that I am afraid to kind of keep dismissing him. So Matt Kuchar, 7,700. He'll be another one that I'll go to here. And finished T20 in 2017, so not great results, but I think he's playing, and more importantly, he's putting a lot better than he did the past 2 years. So those are my couple in the high sevens. I'll kick it over to Jacob.
So to your point earlier, Ben, about Billy Horschel, I do think that he will go overlooked, especially being right there where Kuchar and Cabrera Bayo are. I mean, his tee to green numbers, his approach numbers, his accuracy off the tee and green regulation numbers are just, I mean, they're phenomenal. They might be skewed just a bit by how well he played towards the end of the year, but he's certainly a good ball striker. We know that for sure. The tidbit about his win, a number of years ago at Elevation is just further confirmation for my leaning towards him. And the fact that he hasn't played this event in the last 2 years is even pushes it further, because for me, that's where you would gain leverage as far as ownership goes. So by all accounts, Billy Horschel is probably the primary guy that I would look to in this range for my mindset as far as, GPPs go. Rafa Cabrera Bayo, like Drew said, is a great choice. Have some interest as well. And Charles Howell III, who really has been, we want to talk about consistent form. I mean, he's always been known as a pretty consistent player, been around the tour quite some time. And then he broke through with that win at the RSM during the fall swing. And really since then, hasn't cooled off. I mean, he's made all the cuts. He's had 2 top 10s, including last week with a 6 at the Genesis. Again, the knock on him is going to be he hasn't played this event. How's he going to measure up to a lot of these elite guys that have good course history here? I just find that, him and Horschel both might go overlooked. So certainly worth interest. And then the last guy that I've got some interest in, and you might be able to shed a little bit more light on it, Ben, is Matthew Fitzpatrick at 7,600. Typically known as a really, really solid guy with the flat stick in his hands. He did miss the cut at Pebble his last time out. Prior to that, though, he put in a 16th at Dubai Desert. Again, he has pretty solid finishes here. 16th, first time out in 2017, and 30th last year. Do you have some interest in Fitzpatrick?
Yeah, I think Fitz is interesting because, I don't, not to harp on about the altitude thing, but he's won in Crans in Switzerland twice the last couple of years. So he's obviously adapted well to that. You look at his form at the course, 16th and 30th, that's really solid. He's not done a whole lot wrong, just the third round's kind of killed him both years. He's got Billy Foster on the bag this year, so Lee Westwood's former caddy, Sevy's former caddy, that will only help him. And I don't know how he's viewed in the States, really, because I guess his US form kind of amounts to winning the US Amateur 5 years ago or 7 years ago, and then sort of backdooring a top 10 at the Masters. He's not really gone that next step in the States. In Europe, we're waiting for that to happen because he's just so good under pressure. He really is a world-class player in the making. I mean, the one thing that counts against him in the modern game is that he doesn't hit the ball very far versus some of the other guys that he's trying to compete with. But if he can overcome, I think he can overcome that and really become a world-class player. And I think it might be that Billy takes him to that next level. So he's going to be fascinating to see this year. Obviously, he played poorly at Pebble Beach, which kind of put me off. But then, on the other hand, that was a strange event, some bad weather, a lot of. I mean, JB played even worse, and look at what he did last week. So, there's no reason Fitz shouldn't play really well. I'm a huge fan of his. His game really has very few weaknesses.
All right. The one thing I got as far as the Charles Howell call is obviously I don't know. I didn't look at his elevation numbers or any events he's played in the States at least, but I mean, there's really not that many. But he's always been a notoriously bad wedge player as far as distance control. He's got a very good swing. Ball striking stats look good. But that was the one reason I kept him off my list is if he does have a little bit of issue with the distance control down in Mexico City, it could be just a rough week with the wedges if that's what he has in on every par 4 almost. 125 to 150 yards. So that was the only reason I left him off. I feel like the other guys could adapt. I just know from a history standpoint, Charles Howell has always struggled in some events with his wedges, distance control wise, and I think that's very important on these smaller greens with your wedges. So,
I backed him last week. So obviously, when you back a play, you kind of keep a closer eye on them than perhaps other people do. And it was a continuing theme last week. His approach play was the thing that let him down. I mean, he still finished 6th. It was a very good performance, but he regularly would be 125 from the fairway and hitting it to 40 feet. Mm-hmm. He used to play really well in Colorado in the International, that Stableford event, but that's a long time ago, and it was a strange format event and what have you. And he plays well everywhere, doesn't he? But I think you're right there. There could be a little issue around the approach play because the rest of his game's in great shape, especially the putter at the moment, really consistent.
Yeah, it's just funny, like in Florida, obviously the David Ledbetter Academy's big in Orlando, and I used to go out there from time to time, and the guys would always talk about, funny enough, Freddie Jacobson would go out there quite a bit, but them and the instructors would always talk about Charles Howell, and I was a kid, and I was like, man, Charles Howell, if you could swing like that, like how could you not be on tour forever? And they always talked about his wedge game. He's so methodical and wanting to be technically correct on his swing that he loses the feel aspect. Guys like, DJ and Brooks Koepka, all those guys have the feel aspect. And obviously Charles Howell's a world-class player, but I know it's been a long-standing story with Charles Howell that he can't hit some of those feel finesse shots as well as some of the other guys on tour. So just something I keep on the kind of back of my mind, I guess, in some of these events like shorter courses. All right, let's kind of hit the lower side of the 7K range, and then we'll hop down in the 6K range. I tried to do some extra digging on the 6K range for Ben's sake, especially. But Jacob, we'll start with you in the low 7K. Anybody that's particularly sticking out to you?
So there are a couple names down here that stick out to me. I have always been a big Ty Hatton fan. I know that he has performed well here in his last two events. Certainly, he finished 10th the first time out and then third last year. His form coming in, though, is to the level that I would say concerning. Missed the cut this past week by, I think, 3 strokes or so. Had a decent finish at the Waste Management, but prior to that, 38th, which was, subpar in Dubai, and then missed the cut in Abu Dhabi. His numbers really don't pop off the page either, which is certainly not cause for, running for the hills, but it might be tough to back him if you're just looking at numbers. I know off the tee typically is not his strong suit. He's a good iron player, and, that comes into play a little bit more. We also know how streaky his putter can get from time to time. When it's on and, he's rolling the ball well, then he can play with the best of them. It's just a matter of what Ty Hatton are we going to get this week? Is it going to be the good ball striking week where he's rolling everything in from all over the green? Or is it going to be this, past weekend that we saw at the Genesis? So just some things worth keeping in mind there at Hatton. Another guy that I've got some interest in that I always find myself going back to is Kevin Kisner at 7,200. Certainly he loses really, I wouldn't say he loses his competitive ability when he plays at these longer courses. We know he's a shorter hitter, but I think the elevation sort of levels the field, so to speak, with him and all these big hitters, these bombers like DJ and Brooks and Rory. And I think that's evident by his finishes here the last 2 years. The first time out there in 2017, he finished 11th, last year 29th. And his form coming in, surprisingly, has not been that bad. 28th at Pebble and 26th at Phoenix. Certainly, Kisner probably for me is the guy that I can never get right. I know you guys mentioned, Phil and Xander for the most part, but Kisner seems to be the guy that I always say I'm not going to play or, decide to play one week and he's either off or on. Seems to be very hot and cold, but those are the two primary guys I think in this area that I'm looking at.
Okay. I'll briefly kind of touch on the guys that I'm eyeballing the most. Alexander Noren for sure is going to be on my list. He was a guy I looked at early on in the season, and he didn't do much at the Farmers. He really had a bad front nine, and then played decent on the back, and then came back the last 2 days. Ended up missing the cut by 3 shots, so I'm not too concerned with that. He didn't play well at Phoenix, but 14th place last year. I know Ben might tip him a little bit as far as the elevation thing here in a minute. But yeah, the other two down here is Cameron Smith, 7,400. We just were playing him last week, and he was like 8,500. I know the pricing in this type of field gets a little bit weird, and this is about where the pricing starts to spread out, where you're like, wow, I've never seen, Emiliano Grillo at 6,900. Wow. Stenson at 7,200. But so keep that in mind. As a smaller field, you're going to get those prices. But, Cameron Smith at 7,400 and even Henrik Stenson at 7,200, like I just mentioned. Those are two that I'm going to be playing. I think they're a higher caliber player than where they're priced. And I don't mind paying those type of deflated prices. The other one down here, Lee Westwood, 7,100. He's one in the Sergio category for me, where I've basically been waiting for him to come back to the States to play him. The Saudi International, he missed the cut by 4, but prior to that, he had 20th place back at the DP World Tour in the fall, and then he finished 16th at Abu Dhabi, 7th at Dubai, striking it really well. And at this event 2 years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, he finished 28th, so not awful when he wasn't really playing as well as he is now. So Westwood is probably my favorite. He's in that Sergio category for me that I was so high on him last week. I'm pretty high on Lee Westwood at 7,100. So I'll kick it over to Ben.
Yeah, he got engaged last week as well, so a little upturn for that maybe. I
hope so.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
He's got the check guaranteed, so hopefully he's still got motivation to win with the engagement.
Absolutely, yeah. Stenson really caught my eye at the sort of pricing he's been pitched at. He's missed the first 3 cuts of the year, which obviously isn't ideal. But if you look at the rounds he's shot, sort of averages about 72. It's not a disaster. And actually, although he was kind of all over the place a bit in the Dubai Desert Classic, in the Saudi International, he started to hit the ball well again. He just had 2 putts per round. I think he had 72 putts.
Yeah. That's what I was watching. His ball striking is almost back to where it was, but his putting has been unbelievably awful.
And perhaps it'll stay that way, but he only needs to putt okay, and all of a sudden, he becomes a factor. He ended last year with 4th place in Indonesia, so I don't think he's ever that far away. He actually played here in 2017 and withdrew after I think 10 or 12 holes, and it's funny, he birdied the first 2, and then I think he was 5 over par the next 5, and then gave up. So obviously something was bothering him. That was at a time when he was suffering with his neck a little bit. So it's hard to know what to expect from him, but his name stands out when you look that he's slightly less than Yusel Alton, who's just not anywhere near as good a player. Right. So I think he'd be of interest. Alexander Noren, as you said, I'm pretty keen on him. He played well in this last year without putting well. Typically, putter would be a strength of his. He knows how to play in elite company. I think going back to the Poana thing that we talked about at the start, obviously he was a bit unlucky to be beaten in a playoff for the Farmers last year when JB took all that time to lay up, which I think unsettled Alex a little bit. He's not made a great start to the year, but he ended last year really well, and he's getting to his late 30s now. Sometimes these players just need a little bit longer to shake off the Christmas rust, to remember that the Masters is coming up and they need to start focusing. I mean, it's never really an issue with Alex. He spends more time than just about anybody in world golf, bar Vijay Singh on the range, I would think. So, he'll pick up soon, and it could well be this week. So I thought he was of some interest. Interested to see how Shane Lowry goes. He's kind of been up and down, but obviously he returned to winning form in Abu Dhabi this year. And the other one just to mention is Tom Lewis, right on 7,000 there. If you just take a bare look at his numbers, I think his PGA Tour stats and his WGC form in the past is really bad. But the story of Tom Lewis is that over the last 12 months, he's just elevated his game to the level that everybody thought he was capable of when he burst on the scene as an amateur. If you ask a 20-something Englishman who the best player they played was as an amateur, to a man, they will tell you it was Tom Lewis. And over the last year in Europe, he's clicked. And obviously it resulted in that win in Portugal, but it's also seen him, finish 3rd or 4th in Saudi Arabia when DJ won, and just play well every single week. The exception was last week when he struggled a bit in Perth, but that's a kind of strange format. Obviously, he's got to cope with a around-the-world trip, but he's still young. And this is a great opportunity for him. He's just outside the world's top 50. And if you go back a year, he's outside the world's top 500. So he's really taken off. And he's if you look at like the Fleetwood and the Ross Fisher and some of these English players that have played well here over the last couple of years, he's in the same mold. He hits it high, he hits it far. And I think he'll keep on getting better, whether it's this week or not. He's a name that American golf fans are going to have to become a lot more familiar with over the next 6 months, I think.
Perfect. Yep. I'm looking forward to some Tom Lewis. He'll be on the list for sure as a lower-owned European, most likely. I mean, he's getting some popularity over here. I know guys in the States like to play the European Tour, and he's one of the more popular names. He's always priced, $9K and above in all those events.
I guess he's become impossible to ignore over the last 6 months with this run of top 10s and top 20s, and it's great to see from a sort of non-betting and fancy golf perspective. He went from being the standout young player in Europe to being a lost cause. He couldn't chip, he could barely putt, and it's taken a long, long time and a lot of hard work. So it's nice when that pays off.
That's good. Very good. All right, let's drop into the final range here. 6K. Again, we got decent pricing with it spread out so much with the smaller field. But I'll go ahead and kind of rip off a couple names that I'm eyeballing. It's, hopefully not going to overlap too much with you, Ben, but these are the ones that I really try to key in on the Europeans. And a couple of those names that I really, really liked. One is Erik van Rooyen at I probably butchered that name as well, but 6,400. He finished second at the Hoburg Open last year, so that was at elevation. I like that. He's been a popular name in the States as well. I know guys again that play the European Tour as far as DraftKings go. He's always on the short list of guys to target. Aaron Ray stood out to me, and again, looking at like PGA Tour stuff, these guys won't pop out, so they're good targets. I think they're very good players, and they're good targets that no one will probably try to get. So Aaron Ray at 6,500 is one that I'm really interested in. The other one down there is Lucas Beauregard, 6,500 as well. He's been playing really, really well. He's finished 29th at the Dubai Desert Classic, 49th at the Abu Dhabi, so not great. But prior to that, I mean, I think he went on a run, maybe it was early fall last year, and he was one of the can't-miss kids. A longer hitter. I think just at that price, you're targeting guys with a lot of upside, and Lucas Beauregard should have that upside at 6,500. So
yeah. Sorry, do you mind me jumping in there?
No, please do.
Yeah, I like Lucas a lot. He's a very, very talented young player. They actually took him along as part of the backroom team, if you like, at the Ryder Cup, the European team, because they figure that he'll probably be on the next side, if not the one after that. He's a very, very talented player, and he started to show it. He's actually crept into the top 50 in the world without really playing in majors and World Golf Championships. So he has a little bit to prove in terms of that experience of playing with the best players in the world. But he has the fundamentals to become one of them. He hits the ball a heck of a long way. He's adaptable in terms of conditions. He won the Dunhill Links, and he also won the Portugal Masters. These are completely different events. And he's also got that form of altitude. He was second to Matt Fitzpatrick in Switzerland late last year. He was a little bit unlucky. Looked like he was going to win that, and just got done in a playoff. So, there's a lot to like about Lucas. Aaron Rai is another one. If you go back to his season on the Challenge Tour, one of his 3 wins there was in Kenya, in Nairobi, which is at extremely high altitude. His win on the European Tour late last year was at Fanling in Hong Kong, which is a really tight tree-lined golf course. You put those things together, he's been 7th and 19th in Joburg as well. So for me, he had a profile that looked really, really similar to Shubhankar Sharma, who, if you remember last year, was the big headline maker in this event, because he was second after the first round and led after 54 holes. And everyone's kind of, in Europe, we just got to know him, whereas in the wider world, who is this guy? And Aaron Rai's got a very, very similar profile. If he does make the coverage this week, he plays with 2 gloves. He's very methodical, meticulous, hardworking, keeps himself to himself, and he's going to go a long way in the game. I'm sure of that. Whether he's ready to go and do something this week, we'll see. But if you look for someone who can play a tight golf course and can play at altitude, he ticks both of those boxes.
Perfect.
There are a few more for me. If I can run, do you want me to run through some of the low guys?
Let's hop over to Jacob, and then I'll let you have the floor to finish off this range. And that'll probably take care of all the guys we missed and have no idea who we're talking about. So take it away, Jacob.
Yeah, I don't have a ton here outside of who you really mentioned, Drew. I do have some interest in Grillo there at the top of the 6K range, 6,900. I know his approach numbers are not terrible, but his recent string of form is, less than subpar, I guess we could say. 22nd at the Sony, but outside of that, he came 52nd at the Farmers and then 33rd in Phoenix. He didn't play the event last year, but the year before he finished 52nd. So again, we're seeing really some inconsistencies, which is a bit of a far cry from his performances during the fall swing. I know that really odd team shootout format, he finished second, but prior to that, he had a 15th at Mayakoba. So we certainly know the type of golfer that Grillo can be. He's known as a really solid ball striker. Approach game is typically one of his stronger suits. So that really is what I'm kind of hanging on. It might be or not, but certainly at 6,900, I think that is a price worth taking him at. A little bit lower down, Russell Knox at 6,800, coming in with some really solid form. 14th at the Pebble, or Pebble Beach, AT&T Pro-Am, and then the week before at Phoenix 10th. Really, his run of form during the entire month of January has not been pretty solid, actually. He, outside of the 43rd at the Farmers, he's got three finishes of 220 or better, starting with the Desert Classic in 18th. So I do think that he's worth taking a look at. Also, approach numbers look, really good. And then the last guy that I really am struggling to see at this price range, two, I should say, is Kyle Stanley and Aaron Wise. Both guys, we know them obviously a little bit more here. We know about them and their form and the type of golfer they are. Kyle Stanley played well at the start of the year, I should say the calendar year, at the Sony. And really since then, he's had terrible performances, miscuts. And, I don't really know what to say. If he's hurt, I'm not sure. But typically areas that he excels in, which are accuracy off the tee, ball striking, are areas that he's been struggling in. He did finish 25th here last year. So, if his form was a bit better coming in, I would feel a little bit more confident. Still, at this price, I just, think that at some point his talent level will, begin to build back up to what we're used to seeing. And then there right beside him, the same thing with Aaron Wise. Really just terrible run of form. Had some good performances back in the fall swing. Wise, though, unlike Stanley, has not played this event. So, those for me both are probably just more talent plays than anything. I think they'll probably both be pretty low owned, but it might be worth, hearing what Ben has to say and going with some European guys that have a little bit more bang behind them.
Yeah, Stanley just can't putt, man. His ball striking numbers looked a little bit better last week. But like in round one, he had 33 putts and he hit almost 80% of his greens, and in round two he had 32 putts. So, and he's coming back to POA. Even with the ball striking, I think I'd rather pick on Beauregard or Rye that have more upside and have better form, honestly, coming in. So I'll kick it over to Ben to kind of wrap up the 6K range, or any other thoughts he has on some of these Europeans down here.
Yeah, I'm going to just break from the script and say that of everybody in DraftKings this week, from my first look at the prices, the one I thought was the wrong price was Aaron Wise, because, okay, you just see those 3 missed cuts next to his name since the Tournament of Champions and think he's not playing well, but he's missed all 3 by 1 or 2 shots. Yeah. So 1 or 2 shots here and there, he could have had 3 top 30s, and then all of a sudden we're talking about completely different price and a different profile. He was 6th in the Bridgestone last year, a no-cut WGC. That came on the back of, 5 missed cuts in a row. He went 2nd at Quail Hollow and then won the week after. That came on the back of 3 or 4 missed cuts in a row. He's a young golfer who is really aggressive, and they're prone to these runs of bad form, and then they just click. And to have 4 rounds where he knows he's going to go there and get a check, and he can shoot 75 in round 1 like Brandt Snedeker did 2 years ago and still finish in the top 10 if he keeps applying himself. So I think Aaron Wise is a brilliant play this week. But to stick to my expertise in the Europeans, Danny Willett for first, a former winner in Switzerland. I think he's this price because he played badly here in 2017, his only go in Mexico, but we can just ignore that. I mean, he played badly everywhere the whole year. And then, you have to wait until like October until he bagged the top 20. So he just was in complete disarray. And if you look at him now, to me, he looks like he's got the same profile as someone like Lee Westwood, in that he won towards the end of last year and he started this year really solidly. And yet Willett's right down there at the bottom. And Westwood's a good 500, 600 more. So I thought Willett was really solid. If you're looking for altitude, then David Lipsky, who won at the end of last year in South Africa, he's a winner in Switzerland. I think he's going to be outclassed, but he is one that if you do like that angle, then you could consider that. I think the best value of the Europeans in the low 6,000 range is Alex Bjork. I'm surprised he's 6,100, or sorry, 6,100 as I should probably say. Alex Bjork is a player who won't be on the radar of many American viewers because he simply hasn't played many events at the top level. But in European Tour terms, he steadily improved over the last 2 years. He was a very, very solid rookie, played well in some good fields in the desert. And then last year he went and won in China, his first European Tour win. He was second in the British Masters, which is a very good event. And he's just kept on improving. And he makes a lot of cuts. And obviously we're a no-cut event here, but it tells you something about him. He's very solid off the tee, hits a lot of fairways, finds a lot of greens, and he will play solid golf. And he's kind of got that streak in him where he can go and play 9 holes in 30 shots. So I think he should be one for the sort of shortlist there. And just a word on Sharma as well. I touched upon him very, very briefly. He was 9th here last year, in contention all the way. And if you look at trying to work out why that happened, whether it was just a freak occurrence, well, he won the Joburg Open at altitude. He won the Maybach Malaysia Championship on a really tight, fiddly golf course. He's been 6th in Hong Kong on another tight, fiddly golf course. He played well in Malaysia again last year in the CIMB Classic. So he keeps going to these places where he's got that comfort level and performing. And I don't really see why he wouldn't do that again here. And although, yes, it's not a very good event, he went back to India last week and played on their developmental tour and finished second. And yeah, okay, it's not a great event, but to finish second in a professional golf tournament says that you have played a decent standard of golf. So I think that's probably off the radar of most people. And therefore he could be one that just slips under. I know people see the 9th, I suppose, and just go for him anyway, but he's one to be interested in. If I had to pick out 2 from that low 6,000 range, like I said, I like Aaron Rai and I like Alex Bjork, but the very best of them, I think, has to be Aaron Wise at 6,400. Like, he's so much a better golfer than David Lipsky, and he costs less. And I know it's not always that simple, but Aaron Wise, you go back 6 months or even 3 months when in the FedEx Cup, people are saying this might be a world number one. Yeah. And right. He's missed 3 cuts by 1 shot, and now he's David Lipsky, and I don't see as there are big problems with his game. So I'd keep a close eye on him.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Lipsky because he was one. He's really played decent the last couple months, but with him winning the Omega European Masters back in 2014, it was I was like, maybe he's okay, and nope. The finish from 2 years ago was less than ideal. The last 2 years.
Yeah,
really.
I mean, I don't mean to pick on him because he's won 2 European Tour events. He's a good golfer, but he's exactly the sort of golfer where I see their name in a field like this and just think he's going to be outclassed. Yeah. He's going to finish very close to if David Lipsky finishes 10th, I'll be shocked. If Aaron Wise finishes 10th, I won't be at all shocked. And I think, broadly speaking, that's a decent way to filter these guys. There are exceptions. I know Fabrizio Zanotti was, I think, 12th or 13th here 2 years ago, and he's a similar player to Lipsky. And maybe something will click, and he's probably as confident as he's ever been. But I just think he's outclassed here. And you look just above him is Abraham Answer, and I know he's had a couple of quiet weeks, and the pressure of playing at home might be a negative rather than a positive. But again, he's a much better golfer than David Lipsky, so he'd be like the first one I could look past. And some of those other guys, Jake McLeod is a young Aussie who's getting better, but I think this is too much too soon. George Coetzee is completely out of form. Missed the cut in South Africa last week in a average event, really. And Sean Norris is a bit of a journeyman. He's okay, but again, he would surprise me if he turned up. So I think if you look at that bottom dozen, sort of 12 to 15 players, there are certain names that you can just strike a line through, and there are others that you can build a case for. And I certainly think the likes of Bjerregaard, Rai, Aaron Wise, and even Alex Bjork right down the bottom are those players.
Yeah, I was surprised Scrivener wasn't in the field, but I guess his world ranking just wasn't high enough before he really started playing better or really well. I mean, he's been playing phenomenal. I know he's not in the field, so it's kind of a moot point, but he was one that I'd probably be excited to play.
Yeah, he needs to go and win an event now. I think that's the next thing for him. He won back in Australia a couple of years ago. He's still young, but he just needs to take that next step and win. And sometimes we expect it to happen quicker than it realistically does. But he'll be one of those who you think players like Jason Scrivener, certainly someone like Lucas Herbert, the Australian kid as well, that you'd look for in Europe this year to really take the next step forward.
So 2 other names in this range that I kind of have a question for you about, and one is going to be either really popular based on the name, and I'm not really sold on the recent form, although I
You're
like the
ask me
kid.
about JkrayASU here, aren't you?
No.
No. Sorry, I shouldn't have interrupted. Carry on.
No, man. You got Eddie Pepperell. He's getting a lot of hype, and his last couple events haven't been the best, but I think that'll be a name a lot of Americans will recognize. He's always, doing something funny on Twitter. Obviously, the content thing that the European Tour video they put out a couple weeks ago, that was pretty funny. But Eddie Pepperell is one that I'm curious your opinion. And with Richard Sterney, he's one that's had a quiet, good last couple months. Those two are ones that, do I fall into the Pepperell category or 200 less Sterney, or are those two that maybe I just avoid? What's your kind of thoughts on those two?
So I like both of them. Eddie is one of my favorite players. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. If I dare plug the podcast I'm starting in a month or so, I've got an interview with Eddie lined up. So hopefully people can tune in for that, and it will be a good interview because he has lots to say about all sorts of things. In terms of this week, the two issues for me is I don't think he's playing very well, although he is the sort of player who has just clicked out of nowhere in the past. I just have a little reservation as to whether this is exactly his type of course. I suppose the positive is he doesn't really like hitting driver, and he doesn't have to do that here, so that is a positive. But for me, he's more of a bit of wind would be a good thing for one thing. I think he probably wants something a little bit more British in style of play. He won in Qatar, which is actually a kind of linksy type course, and then he won the British Masters when it was cold and you had to grind. And I think maybe for now that would suit him a bit more. Sterney, the big plus for him, I suppose, although I think he lives in Manchester, England now. He used to live in South Africa, where he's from, obviously, and he's won the Joburg Open a couple of times. So playing at altitude won't be a problem for him. He's the sort of player I always look to when we've got a cut, because he makes a lot of cuts, and he's often quite low owned when in my limited experience compared to you guys playing DraftKings. But he is that sort of player who's often off the radar. But whether he makes enough birdies to be of interest this week, I'm not sure, but he'll certainly be comfortable at altitude. Okay.
Awesome. Well, we'll leave it at that. I think we got enough to chew on for now, and enough advice and information to kind of make some lower price plays for these Europeans. So again, Ben, we really appreciate you coming on the podcast. Go ahead and tell us what you're working on. You mentioned the podcast that you're starting up. Tell us a bit of your projects, or plug whatever else you need to throw our way.
That's very kind of you. It's been fun talking to you guys. I'm starting a podcast with a guy called Alex Perry, who again some of your listeners might know. He's a fairly well-known golf journalist over here. And we're going to try and do a golf podcast that a little bit different to, I guess, what people expect from me in particular. They kind of think I'm just going to talk about betting all the time. But we're going to try and talk to as many players as possible. I've actually got Willie Wilcox, who you guys will know, I'm sure. Yeah. He's kindly agreed to come on and talk about the time he made a hole-in-one at Sawgrass. So that's going to feature in our first episode, which is Players Championship Week. But as the year goes on, hopefully we're going to talk to caddies and coaches and just try and get a feel for professional golf that isn't necessarily all about winning money on it. And then other than that, I'm just looking forward to, I'll be going to the Open this year, so if anyone's there, come and say hi. I always get out to that and work from the Open, and obviously before that we've got some big events, and I'll be doing the usual stuff. I profile every player in the Masters field every year, and that's been a fairly popular feature for the last couple, so look out for that. But I'm grateful to come on and chat with you guys.
No, we really appreciate it. So for Jacob, again, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you to everybody that listened this week for the WGC Mexico Championship, the FGB podcast. So if you'd like, you can find us online at fantasygolfbag.com. All of our content and tools are located there. And of course, we'll be back. Jacob and I will be back on Wednesday evening for the WGC live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern. So you can come hang out. We got a good group of people in there, a full chat. The thing goes wild. So definitely check that out. That's at twitch.tv/Redkacheek. And of course, guys, good luck this week. Good luck with your lineups. You can find myself on Twitter at Redkacheek, Jacob at JkrayASU, and you can find Ben on Twitter at Ben Coley Golf. We'll leave it at there, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you later this week.